Hi guys, it's Ed. Hey, happy Monday. Today we're going to talk a little bit about dungeon design, uh, making kind of a cohesive and semi-logical dungeon instead of something that's just kind of filled with random monsters, and personal campaign building. To start out, I just want to respond very briefly to Roll Stats, which is an awesome YouTube channel. It does a fantastic job on all kinds of topics that have to do with Dungeons and Dragons. In his most recent video, just about 3 days ago, he was bringing up people who say that campaign building or homebrew is really the only way to play D&D. Now, I agree with him in that obviously that is false. And in fact, for most people, it's probably easiest to pick and choose from different boxed campaign settings that are already published, like the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Ravenloft or whatever campaign setting sort of suits the genre that they want to go for, rather than having to make things from scratch. So I just wanted to share that I am not one of the people in the camp that says that only someone who's making their own campaign material or their own homebrew material is somehow like correct. You know, I'm not a purist. I completely understand the need to save time. This channel is for dungeon masters who are interested in doing their own homebrew material, using some of the simpler graph paper and pencils and pens, traditional media that go all the way back to the beginning of the game, either because they have a love for world building or maybe for economic reasons. You know, it's not cheap to buy all these different campaign books, even if they're a collection of PDFs. But going down and buying a pad of graph paper and a couple of pencils is super inexpensive, and it can keep you going for a long time with building your world. So enough of that. So today we're going to be using the Monsters book from Old School Essentials. Old School Essentials is a great clone of the Basic and Expert rules set, which is one of my favorites and the one that I'm using to build my campaign. And then we're just going to be using a simple pencil and some graph paper to kind of talk about it. So when you think about a dungeon really can be anything. It can be a tower, can be a collection of buildings, an old ruined keep. Maybe the tower has different levels in it. It could be a huge estate that's got multiple stories, and maybe it's got a stair that goes down underground and a subterranean level. Maybe it's even got 2 subterranean levels underneath it, kind of getting into the more traditional dungeon. It can also be your traditional dungeon, which has got, multiple levels that are usually connected by stairs or passageways, or maybe pit traps that drop you down to the next level, that sort of thing. One reason I want to kind of get your thinking out of the box that a dungeon is just the traditional, underground lair or monster menagerie, is that a dungeon is really anywhere that your player characters are going to be spending a good chunk of a game session doing exploring, combat, finding cool loot and solving mysteries, just like they would in an underground dungeon. And so that's why I want to kind of bring up the above ground dungeons of towers and estates and castles and ruined castles and other kinds of ruins. Because you can treat those just like dungeons as well. In the case of a tower, maybe the first level of the dungeon is the base, or the base of the tower where you enter, and then each level that you ascend up into the tower gets progressively tougher, going, kind of in reverse. So when you start talking about dungeons as underground locations, you kind of have the traditional dungeon, and I'm going to try to pull a sample out of one of my own notebooks here. All right, so here's an example of a traditional dungeon. It's got a majority of the rooms are kind of squared out. I kind of think of them in this fashion, although you can also have maybe a mix of kind of standard rooms and caverns and that sort of thing. And this is a copy of an earlier map that I made going all the way back to 10 or 12 years ago. Maybe even longer than that, when I started to get back into early editions of the game. And I sort of went through phases. I played Swords and Wizardry, which is an awesome retro clone. I played first edition AD&D again for a while. I played Menser D&D for a while, and Holmes D&D. The Blue Home retro clone is awesome as well. And so I sort of floated in and out for a couple years, still doing kind of old traditional D&D, but kind of experimenting with different rule sets as they came out and getting excited about, a few aspects of one or the other. And then finally going back to the BX version of the rules and realizing that that's kind of my personal sweet spot. It's not that that's a better or worse than any other rules that are out there, or better or worse than 5th edition. It's just, for me personally, that's the edition that I like to play the most and like to write material for the most. So when I was doing these maps, I wasn't really giving a lot of consideration into who built this place. I was just kind of doing maps based out of the old books. And when you think about it, somebody going underground and carving out all these passages in the concept of a fantasy setting, you're talking about an underground dwelling race that's going to be like the dwarves, or maybe if your goblins are fairly advanced and good underground builders, the goblins, hobgoblins, and some sort of specific race, meaning that I think personally there should be some reason why this underground complex exists. Now, there are a lot of reasons why it could. Magic could be one. You could just say, well, a wizard built it. But at least that's better than nothing, okay? You could also design this as sort of a sunken city. Maybe this was an ancient city that has long since sunk underground, and that explains why maybe these, if you divided these up instead into different kinds of buildings or clusters of buildings connected by caves, you could get away with having a really cool underground dungeon which had a lot of these sort of finished rooms in it. But I think by and large, if your goal is to have a better suspension of disbelief and a more logical building of your dungeon, what you're going to want a majority of is caverns. And typically caverns are going to be created by a water source flowing underground and eroding through limestone and different sorts of rock material. And because of that, when you're doing caverns, I think something that can make them more interesting is having the flow of the water from level to level kind of defined, so that you can kind of tell where the water flows into a low spot. Maybe it enters an underground river or something like that. Hopefully, maybe it flows down into the lower levels of your dungeon. But I think that interaction between where the water is cutting through now and the caves that it's left behind, along with maybe some finished caverns created later by dwarves or cultists or somebody else, like a smaller section of finished construction underground like this could have been made by cultists, humans, or really just about any race. Whereas those giant mega dungeons, I think it's harder to have suspension of disbelief, especially for older players, on why they exist underground. So you're all keen to create a dungeon. What's one of the first things you do? Well, I think the first thing that you need to do is come up with a story as to what is gonna be the story behind your dungeon. So in this example, I'm just going to use kind of the one I've been working on the most, which is the dungeons under the city of Bulgrad. So you've got the Cunning Tor, if we're looking at it from the side up here. You've got the city on top, some walls and buildings and that sort of thing. And you know, when you're planning, you don't have to be pretty about any of this. You're just kind of really just fleshing it out for ideas, right? So on the top, you've got the Cunning Tor, and you've got some natural fissures in the ground, and then just the way that the water goes underground during the winter months especially, but just in rain and that sort of thing, kind of has water going underground. And over time, that's created these natural caves. And so you're going to want a few cave entrances, or at least for me, I want a few cave entrances out on the side of the Cunning Tor. Some of them are well known because they've got water flowing out of them into the surrounding countryside. So maybe one of your cave entrance A is obvious and just about everybody knows about it. Maybe a different cave entrance you have over here in a wooded area on the side of the hill, and only a few people know about it, and maybe only the city watch knows about that entrance because of their patrols. And maybe you have other entrances up in the city where the city water system and sewers kind of connect up. So you have, you know, basement access points that go into the sewers that maybe connect eventually down into these caves, either through stairs or tunnels or by some other means. But this first level of cavern, natural caves, I would consider maybe that to be the true first level of the dungeon. Okay? And then underneath that, maybe you have other sections of caves. Some of them are connected by tunnels. So you've got kind of a sub-level there, and then you've got another cave level here. And then in a section, these caves once were the dwelling of a goddess named Aglaika, and there's her father was turned to stone by her on accident. She was cursed and turned into a Medusa. So somewhere down here on the fourth level, the bottom level, as far as I'm concerned, of this dungeon, there are some lakes where these waters kind of collect before they maybe meet natural rivers going out in different directions. And then somewhere in here is that statue of Aglaika's father, frozen in stone, the old elven god of magic. And he's emanating some kind of weird arcane radiation that's affecting the different creatures in the bottom levels of the dungeon. Okay? So when this city was occupied by the Wraith King, he was interested maybe in this remains of this god, this elven god of magic. So he built his own finished level in here, just right around level 3, maybe connected by some caves and that sort of thing, where he had experiments on some of these mutated creatures to sort of investigate their effects. So unfortunately, I only have 15 minutes for each of these videos right now, which I'm going to figure out how to increase. So I'm going to think about continuing this either later today or tomorrow, but I think that's where we're going to wrap up. And in the next video, we're going to take our monster book and we're going to start thinking about if we were making a dungeon from scratch, how we would do that. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.